So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about how to use on-skin silicone. So you can use like Artex or 3rd degree. Those are usually the most common ones to make quick injuries. I really like to use these for theater just because I think it moves really well. So if you have to do anything on the face, it's not going to be like inhibiting your performer's movement or their singing in any way. I think it holds onto the skin and reacts a lot better to sweat than a lot of like things that you have to apply with like spirit gum do. And I also think that you don't come across quite as many allergies with silicone as you often do with latex. So I'm a huge fan of Artex and 3rd degree. Skin tight is another one, but I think it's a little bit more common that you see 3rd degree and Artex. So you can use it directly on the skin. You can pre-make pieces in molds to glue on. You can like freeform things on wax paper and then adhere it later. If you're gonna apply it in molds, so this is one that I made with Artex. These are just a couple of different little like prosthetics that I could cut out and then put onto the skin. So that is one option. Or you can just build things directly onto the skin with it. Technically with Artex, and probably 3rd degree too. I've only ever done it with Artex, but you can actually use it for beauty makeup as well. I've like filled in scars and everything with it. So it's like a very versatile product. And I think it's one that could be used a lot more in theater, and it just isn't, because I think a lot of people are used to using like waxes or even like latex, but the silicones are just a little bit more like skin friendly than the other ones are, I think. So the very first thing, you need to make sure that you have something to scoop it out of the containers with and that you have something to mix it on. I really like to use disposable palettes or like metal palettes. Silicone can get a little bit tricky to get off of things, so I think the disposable things are great, or like the metal palettes, it likes to come off of really easily. In my experience, it doesn't always come off of plastic the easiest, so just kind of be careful about that. So whenever you're working with silicones, it's gonna always come in 2 parts. So there's gonna be a part A and a part B. So I wrote my initials, just ignore the B that's on that. But there's gonna be 2 separate parts. The most important thing, so whether you're using Artex or 3rd degree or skin tight, is that you have to keep the 2 parts separate until you're ready to use them. So if I like dip my spatula directly from A into B, it's going to start forming inside of this, and then the entire jar is going to be ruined. That's like the #1 thing I see people do wrong with these. It's like 30 bucks for these little jars. So you want to make sure you're not wasting your money and you're not immediately ruining your product. So scoop out of one, completely clean off your spatula, scoop out of the other, then you can mix them on your palette together and that's fine, but just know as soon as the 2 parts meet, they're going to start forming, and it is like a time sensitive thing. You have roughly probably like 5 to 7 minutes. I think 3rd degree sometimes it seems to take a little bit longer to dry than Artex does, but you don't have a ton of time to work with it, so you want to make sure that the 2 parts are as separate as possible until you're ready for them not to be. You can mix flocking into them, silicone colorizers, cream makeup. I put glitter in them. Pretty much anything you can colorize these with, or you can paint them afterwards. They're pretty much going to be like a clear. 3rd degree makes a few more like skin tone shades and also like a blood shade. Artex is pretty much only like kind of like a clear, generalized, lighter-ish skin tone, but they're pretty easy to tint and to change if you want to. So I'll go ahead and I'll probably just do a little like injury right here, because that's probably gonna be the easiest to see. So you just want to make sure you don't have to put any adhesive down with it. If you're going to be wearing it for like 18 hours or something, you might want to throw a little bit of like silicone adhesive or something down, but generally it holds really well on the skin, so you don't really have to worry about it as much. It doesn't really matter which part you scoop out first, as long as your spatula is clean when you're doing that. So I'm going to clean it off with alcohol before I even scoop everything out, and then I'm going to clean it off in between as well. So you have to remember the amount that you're scooping out is going to double. So if you're only doing something small, you don't have to scoop out a ton of it. I've taught a lot of classes where I've seen people scoop out way too much and then not really know what to do with it. So you may want to be careful with that kind of a thing, because you don't necessarily want to like overdo it. So you can use silicone to make like burns, you can make it to make like cuts, scars, any kind of injury. Like I said, you can also use it to like fill in scars that somebody might have. We'll probably just do like a little wound with this and keep it kind of basic, but you just want to make sure that you're just keeping the 2 parts separate. Usually the part B from Kryolan, depending on the one that you have, usually you need to like mix the pigment into it a little bit. Part B is a different consistency, so don't think that something is necessarily wrong with it. That's just kind of how it's like supposed to be. And then I'll show you before I mix them. You want the parts to be as equal as possible. It's not something that you have to like measure out, but you do want to try to keep them relatively equal, so that way it cures and like sets properly, because silicone can be, though it's easy to use in this format, it can be a little bit tricky when it comes to like setting properly. So I usually end up putting a little bit of setting powder on it, and that helps a lot. So you're going to be kind of like at this point where I've got like my 2 chunks of silicone, and then you can just scoop one into the other, and then you basically, I always tell people it's kind of like you're like frosting a cake almost. You just kind of like, everything is super reflective, but you just kind of like move it back and forth until it's evenly mixed, and you can start to kind of like feel it setting up a little bit. And so you really want to, once it's evenly mixed, and this is another reason I like to use spatulas to do this, because you can just like spatula it kind of like directly onto the skin. I know I am very pale, so this can get a little hard with the white balance, but hopefully we can do something here. So let's go ahead, and what I always do is I tell people kind of like blend your edges out first, and then you can worry about adding in your cuts and everything. I think what we'll do a burn with this one. So with burns, I like to keep the edges really, really thin. I always go back with like the spatula and I kind of just like pull them a little bit, and that helps to kind of like thin them out. When it's really, really wet, when you first put it on, especially if it's on the face, it's going to want to drip. So you might have to fight it a little bit. That is one of the trickier parts of silicone. But otherwise it adheres really nicely. So if you're trying to do like a burn makeup, I always like to go back with like my spatula, and I just kind of like press up and down. I think that's a lot easier to get sort of that like gnarled skin effect than it is to sit there and try to like cut into it, because then I think it's like you try to make it a little bit too perfect, but this gives it a little bit more of like a haphazard sort of an application. So you can see even like that alone, once it's dried and powdered, that would be a great, like, it's great for like scars as well, and like a burn scar or something. And then what we can do is we'll go ahead and I can give myself like a little cut on the face. We'll do a tiny little cut right here. And so again, it's getting a little bit drier, but sometimes on the face it's a little easier to wait until it's slightly drier. With silicone, it's going to seem like you don't have any edges, but then you go to put the makeup on it and you see them. So always make sure, I know it's clear so it's hard to tell, but just make sure you're really pressing your edges down. And then you can kind of just like cut right into the center of it. And then that's where our little cut can be, right on the face. So this one might have been a little bit too dry, so it's going to be a little trickier to kind of get to blend in, but usually you can kind of paint it and get it to kind of do what you want. And again, so I always like to powder it. I think it depends on who you're talking to. Some people don't. It gets a little frustrating when you don't, because sometimes it can get a little bit too sticky, especially if you don't mix it up like perfectly. So I usually like to powder it. I feel a little bit better about like painting it and stuff, but I've worked with plenty of people that don't. I think test it, see like how hard and how dry it feels. If it doesn't feel like it's dry, I would put a little translucent powder on it. The translucent powder does kind of take the shine away though, so it kind of, that's unfortunate when you are doing like burns or like burn makeup, because usually the skin has sort of that like waxy appearance to it. But I just think it's better, especially for like theater or something, for like longevity, to make sure that it is powdered just so that it stays on. So me personally, I like to powder it. Not everybody does, so that's kind of like your own call. If you are using like a palette that is not disposable, I recommend letting the Artex or the 3rd degree or whatever it is that you're using completely dry on it before you try to like get it off, because it's, when it's like gooey still like this, it just wants to stick to everything. So it's a little bit easier to just let it dry and then peel it off later, because it can get, silicone is really easy to take off the skin. Where basically when you're done with this, you can just like pull it back off. Usually I'll use like a little bit of like an oily makeup remover, but generally you can just kind of like pull it back off and you're good to go. But it can get a little bit tricky when it's on other surfaces, it doesn't necessarily like to come off. When I've gotten it on my clothes, I haven't really been able to get it off really well, so that's another thing to kind of watch out for. It may not want to come off of clothes or anything, so just be careful with that kind of stuff. And then to color this, I'm just going to use cream makeup. The water activated paints don't work very well just because silicone and water do not mix usually, so that's not always my favorite to use, but I think I have done it before. I feel like as long as you're like careful and as long as it's powdered down, most things will stick to it. But I usually use like a cream. I think alcohol paints look the most realistic. You just want to be careful of whatever part of skin you're on, just because it can be really drying, so I don't do anything too close or on the eyes or around like the mouth or nose. Some people do, but that is not my personal thing to do things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and put powder on it first, just because that was the way I was kind of always taught to do it and the way I prefer. I usually just powder it with like a sponge, just because it sticks to everything, so your brushes might get stuck to it. So if you're not sure if it's like at the point where you can powder it yet, so you want it to be sticky but not quite as sticky as this is, so I do think I need to give it a second before I put any powder on it. So that's the thing. So silicone, it does take, it's not too long that it takes to dry, but it definitely does take a little bit of time, so it's something that you definitely need to make sure that you plan for. So I'm going to go ahead and get my makeup kind of scooped out. So I'm going to use like my burn and injury wheel from Kryolan, and then my bruise wheel, and that should be enough. And I have a little bit of blood to do just something quick. So we'll do like a slight burn. We won't do like a super like charred awful one. We'll just do one that's a little bit burned, maybe more like 2nd degree, so it'll be kind of just like pinky and reddish, and then we'll just kind of do this like a basic cut. So we'll grab a couple colors. I think I have a tendency to like overpaint things, so it can be a little bit tricky, I think, to know like when to stop painting something or how much color to put on something. So I try to scoop out a little bit less in hopes that I won't use a ton. I think it's great to use a lot of different colors, but I also think that sometimes that can make it look too overdone. So I think it is really important to always like look at like reference photos and things, just so you know what exactly it is that you are really trying to create, so that you are actually making something that looks realistic. And then keep in mind too, if you're doing theater, you might have to do something that looks a little bit too intense up close, but it's going to have to read from further away, so you might have to highlight and shade these in ways that you wouldn't do if you were doing something that someone's going to be right up to them, because chances are they're going to be really, really far away. So if I do like this really subtle paint job, it might look really realistic up close, but you might not even see it from further away. So I'm going to go ahead and just powder this. Just know whatever color powder you put on it, it definitely takes on the color. So this is a colorless one, so for me, because I'm so pale, it's not too bad to use, but I generally try to match the color of the powder to somebody's skin as much as possible, just because I think that ends up with a little bit more of like a realistic makeup, and I think you can see it a little bit more easily on my face. You can see that area got really white. When you use alcohol paints, it's not like a big deal, because the 99% alcohol just kind of eats away the extra powder, and even if you spray like a little bit of like setting spray on it, that'll get rid of the extra powder, but it is something to be aware of if you're working on deeper skin tones especially. You want to make sure that you are using the right color for them. So you can kind of see, so it's harder to get up close without the white balance getting too intense. Did that help it? That made it even brighter. Let's see. So you try to fix these things and it just doesn't work. So you can kind of see it's pretty much like flesh tone. If this was just like a scar, I'd probably just have to put a little bit of color over it, and it would be good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and start painting these now. So usually I'll use like a combination of like brushes and sponges when I paint these things, but I always try to start, no matter what I'm using, I try to start with like my lightest colors first. With most injuries, I use like a pinky color like that, and then some kind of a yellow. You do need to adjust it to the skin tone of the person that you're working on, because what is appropriate on my skin tone is not going to work on somebody who's a lot deeper. So you need to find like what their kind of like, I guess like skin irritation reddish tone would be. For me, this is like the one that works on me, but for someone who's deeper, it's going to have to be a slightly like deeper shade, depending of course on the injury that you're doing. So that's always something that you need to keep in mind. So if you're just doing like if this was like, and see, this is why I also like it, because like this could be like a rash, or you could like turn this into like acne or something if somebody had to have that for a show. And I just think it's such an easy thing to use and to do. And I know it can be a little trickier to like get the consistency of it, but I just think it's just so easy. It doesn't feel like anything. Like I don't feel like I have a ton of makeup on my chest. And that is usually really ideal when you are working on shows. So you can kind of see, so we're at a point where I'm like, okay, this has got some color to it, not bad. And I try to get it to pick up a little bit more. And then you're going to notice when you're doing stuff like this that certain areas just pick up more color than others. I usually just try to kind of like go with that. And I just kind of, I always say like to let the shadows find themselves, which sounds really dramatic, but I think it's true, because I think if you try to push something to be too dark where it wouldn't naturally be, and like where it doesn't want to pick it up, then that's when stuff starts to look a little bit fake. Okay, so at this point we're getting some good color. I always try to make sure my edges are like blended but like uneven at the same time, just so that it looks more natural. And two, so if this was going to be some kind of a skin rash, we'd probably be good and be done here. But if we're trying to make it look more like a chest burn kind of a thing, it's going to need a little bit more color. For most burns that I do, I always put a little bit of like a goldeny yellow color in it. Again, the deeper the skin tone, usually I have it be more, a little bit more golden than this. If you need it to be really, really seen, like from super far away, you might have to go with like a more vibrant yellow. But I usually like to just add it in just so that I have kind of like a highlight color. But I think it's really important with burn makeup is that you have to like let some of the skin show through, because if you don't, I feel like that also kind of gets to a point where it starts to look a little bit non-realistic. Okay, and again, this is kind of just like laying down a little base layer. So usually like the more specific I start to get with the colors, that's when I start to use brushes. But for like that first base layer, usually I'm not using any kind of a brush or anything for that. Since it's just creams, you can pretty much use like any kind of brush to put it on. I think I usually have mostly synthetic brushes, but pretty much anything will kind of work. And so I'm going to use kind of like a fluffier like eyeshadow brush and just sort of like stipple some color over this. And again, burns can be, I think burns are like one of the hardest makeups to do. And you might think like, why would I ever have to do like a burn in like theater makeup? I've worked on 2 shows now where I've had to have 2 different kinds of burns. So in Evil Dead the musical, somebody has a sunburn, so that's like a less intense kind of burn that you might have to do. But then in the show Fuddy Mears, which I worked on pretty recently, they had to have a really intense like ear burn that like went down into like a scar on their face, and we used basically like the same method and almost like color palette to kind of create that, at least as far as like the scarring goes on the face. And then I used silicone on the prosthetic as well, so it might be something that I feel like you may not think that you're ever going to use in theater, but you would actually be very surprised at how much something like this could actually come up. And then usually I just kind of like add colors to taste. So I'm going to take like a slightly darker pinky color, and I usually just go over the colors that are already picking up the darker parts. And a lot of times this is just so like on stage it reads as being visible. So if it's something that's a scar, usually it's just going to have sort of like the pinkier shades, and it might have less of like the redness. But when I worked on Fuddy Mears and we had to have a burn for that and the burn scar, they did end up having to add in darker colors just so that it could be seen on stage. So that's something that you kind of always have to keep in mind. And again, I like to like stipple and like press the color on so that way it stays a little bit more like natural looking. You could add in like white spots to be like blisters if you wanted to. So if we were going to do that, I could do that with like, you could use like 2+ to do that. You could just use like white cream makeup like I'm going to do, whatever the medium of makeup is you could use. But you can pretty much just kind of do whatever you want with this. Like I said, I think it pretty much like any kind of makeup really, as long as it's powdered down. The water activated paints don't love it, but it definitely, if you try hard enough, you can get it to work. And so this is something with the white, you want to be careful that you don't do it too much, but usually at this point in like a burn, you're gonna have like a little bit of blistering, so popping a couple of little white areas in here will kind of show that off. You just want to make sure you're not like overdoing it, but again, I think burns are like one of the hardest kinds of makeup to do, but I think once you can figure out like how to get that texture in it, that can make a huge difference. So if you were gonna make this like really scarred looking or charred looking, what I usually like to do is use I usually use like a black powder, so either it's like a dirt powder or like Kryolan just makes like body powders, and they have one that's like a solid matte black. I use that and I go over the whole thing, and then I actually use Kryolan's Effects Blood in the lightest color, and I put that over it, and then I layer more powder over it, and that gives it like a really like shiny kind of like volcanic kind of a look actually. But if you want to just work with like the basic cream makeup, which a lot of the times in theater that is all that you have, you can just take either like a black eyeshadow, or I'm going to take black cream makeup and really lightly. So I think the key is, if you're like trying to do something that's more charred, is you don't necessarily want like the entire thing to be like that. I try to keep it more to just like the edges of it, and you really want to just like lightly stipple it on, because you have to remember that as soon as you put black on something, it is really hard to ever like undo that. So I think especially the charred parts work best where it's like the reddest. So I'm gonna make sure I just try to focus it on those areas. I think the powder really gives it like that nice like charred look, but again, not everybody is gonna have access to that, because in theater a lot of times we do just have like these cream makeups, and that's totally fine. You can definitely make anything work as long as you have the colors that you need, and you're kind of like putting it on in the kind of correct way. So an area like that where like my skin maybe got a little bit charred, that's not necessarily what I'm going for. So I can take maybe a little bit more of this pink and then try to just sort of like thin that out. So if you're like, oh, maybe now that I have more charred, but maybe I need more really intense red spots, you can add that in. But again, I still like, even when I do have like the whiter like blister spots, I still like to have like a little bit of skin, just because I do think that helps it look not necessarily natural, because it sounds weird to say that about like a burn, but I think it helps it look a little bit more realistic when you are doing these kinds of things. So again, you can kind of sit here and do that to like taste. I'd probably like wipe off the extra around the edges, but I do usually like to have some kind of like shading around the edge like that, just so that it kind of makes it look like it's coming out of the skin. And I think especially for theater too, that helps give it, just like you like highlight and contour your face, that's almost like contouring behind that, so that way it like pops out and is more visible from on stage. And then, so if you want to do just like a simple little cut, so I'm lucky to where like this is almost my skin tone, because I'm really pale, but you could paint around it, you could have mixed someone's foundation into it, but I'm just gonna put this dark burgundy color in the center. So I don't usually put just like a pure red, and I don't like to put, I used to put black, but I actually prefer putting this like burgundy color in the center of wounds now. I just think it helps it look, it gives it like a nice, it almost like shades it, I guess that's like it, it gives it a little bit more depth than if I just put in bright red. I can certainly like mix some red, but sometimes with theater you might need like a blood effect, but putting blood on someone might not be realistic because they might be moving around a lot and you have to just kind of like fake the blood effect. So that's why I like to do things like this, just because I think that that sort of a color, if I just kind of like blend it a little bit, that's gonna help it look like it's like bloody, without having to have blood dripping off of someone, and then you don't have to risk it like getting onto costumes. So I'm just gonna use like a coarser stipple sponge, which is usually the kind I use for injuries, and I'm just kind of like, I don't have anything on it, I'm just going over what's already on my face, and just kind of blending that a little bit. So that would help, especially if you only have a little bit to do it. Even just using this sort of a color to like paint an injury on and kind of shade around it, that definitely helps a lot and helps it look a little bit more realistic. You could go around it and kind of like shade and give a little bit of color to it. You just want to be careful that you don't do too much, because sometimes I think that's what makes it look a little bit fake, but it is nice, I feel like, especially like at the edges, especially if it's any kind of like a scar thing. I think that helps it just look like it's actually coming out of the skin. Just because if something is going to be raised up, it's naturally going to cast shadows, so I think kind of mimicking that with the makeup you're applying always helps it look a little bit more realistic. And again, you just want to keep it sort of as like natural and normal as usual. Usually with effects makeup I do end up using my hands a little bit, but since it's my own face, that's not that bad, and it's sanitized and everything. But if you are not working on your own face, make sure your hands are washed. If you have to touch someone's face, probably a good idea to have on gloves, or to be using something disposable if you have to get that close. So if you were done with these two, you would want to just like powder them down, since we did use creams. I like to use like our liquid setting spray over injuries, because it makes them not like an aerosol one, like the spritzier kind, just because it kind of gives like a gloss to everything, and that kind of helps. One, it'll get rid of any extra powder, but then it also just kind of helps it look a little bit more like an injury, and it just like, it looks really nice when the light hits it. If you wanted to add blood to this, so I'm going to use the Ben Nye Stage Blood. This one's probably not, it kind of dries a little. I would probably use a blood that like definitely dried down if I had to use something like this for stage. This one is more of like a kind of like drippy effects blood, but since I feel like this is like the common blood that most people have, I'm going to use this, and I'm just going to kind of like fill in. And so it's a little bit brighter, but that can be good for stage, just because sometimes you have to push things a little bit bright in order to get them to show up on stage. And so something like that, that'll help give a little bit more texture to it. If you had to give something, like if I also need like a cut or something, I could take that same blood, or if I mean like a scrape to go with it, and you could just kind of take this and just scrape right through it like that, and then that'll dry down on my face, and I'll also have that kind of an injury. So it's really easy to create like little things like that if you have to, but again, before I put that blood in, if I was going to keep this for longer than just this video, I would have set it with my powder, spray it with some setting spray, put on my blood, and then I'd probably spray it with a little setting spray again, just to make sure that the blood and everything stays on. But hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight into Artex, and as I hold it wrong, into Artex and into just like silicone and stuff in general, and it also helps you figure out how to make cuts and burns and quick little blood effects.